All right, so this is going to be a quick video. Well, they're all kind of quick nowadays. I gotta stop saying that they're going to be quick videos. To be honest, I record these on my phone, and my phone only really likes to record about 30 minutes of video before it decides to give me grief. So it kind of puts an artificial constraint on my videos, but it is a useful constraint because it keeps these videos from being gigantic, rambling pieces of death. So this video is going to be about, well, actually kind of a follow-up to my previous video on character race and going beyond character race. But this is going to be a video sort of more focusing on working within character race and how to better, I believe, or how to better your character and your role-playing through really paying attention to what it is that makes up the various races in D&D. It's not going to be comprehensive. I'm not going to go bit by bit on every race, but certainly could if this proves popular or if you have specific requests. But I have to give a bit of a shout out to my buddy Jason, who runs the Mechhead Studios YouTube channel. He has his Talking D&D playlist over there, and I caught his video that he had done actually as sort of a counterpoint, or not even counterpoint, but a companion piece to my original D&D races video. So thank you, Jason. I was listening to your podcast on the way, or not podcast, but your video on the way home from work. I just let the YouTube channel run in the background over the car speaker, and it got me thinking about. So we talked about how some of the races in D&D, as written in the books, don't make the best player character races. It got me wondering, how could you play truer to the D&D races as written and still have an interesting and useful character? So some of the toughest ones, I think, to play are, I think, the elves. If we're going by standard book races, elves have to be one of the hardest ones to play. So I think I could use them as a good example. So as written, elves are kind of long thinking. They are long lived. They don't have a sense of immediacy. They do not look on the world in the same way as the other shorter lived races. Even those races that live particularly long, but not as long as elves, they sort of have a difference in their outlook. So using the elves as an example, how can you use this elves as written? How can you use elves as written and still make them effective D&D characters? The obvious answer, of course, is to run an elf party. But I think actually an elf party, an all-elf party, would be even worse and less useful, less effective than trying to play a true elf, for lack of a better term, in a mixed party. The reason for that is that given an all-elf party would be given to elvish behavior and hindered by elvish behavior, and with no counterpoint or driving force from outside themselves. So, going from there, so what is it that really makes elves, as written, tough to play? I mentioned that their outlook is different. Well, let's hone in on that for a bit. So an elf really is going to look at every moment of his life as a protracted event. Everything he does is going to be done with no sense of immediacy. Now, that is in itself, I think, misleading, in that that when it's written, when you read about elves in the various manuals, whatever edition or mainstream D&D game you're running or playing, the elves are generally depicted very similarly, even though they may be Quellan SD or Kagan SD or Gray or Moon or purple, whatever. I think it's, first of all, it's important to recognize that slow thinking, lack of immediacy is the elven way, but clearly it can't be the only way that they behave. Just like dwarves may be gruff and very stern and very grounded and earthy, it can't be the only way they think, because they would have to have thought in other ways to exist and continue existing. Not all gnomes can be scattered, flighty, or at least they can't be scattered and flighty all the time. There is a time when any of these behaviors would likely be set aside. So, going back to elves, if you have an elf character and you're trying to play an elf truer to the description as written, then your elf, while he, is in his day-to-day, sitting at home, in his downtime between adventures, while he may end up being, a little on the slower side, because he's taking his time and he's putting the time and the effort into everything. I don't think that an elf presented with immediate danger would hesitate. I imagine that elves, this may be part of the mythos of the elves, whereas, one of the things that makes elves stand out in campaign settings that have them is that this supernatural agility of theirs is accentuated by the fact that normally they're very easygoing, slow to rouse, even-tempered, but when they do act, it's quick and concise. So, remembering when you're playing that elf character that just because, every meal is something that takes 3 days to plan, 2 days to cook, and an entire evening to eat, doesn't mean that he's going to let the party die or sit by idly while everybody's suffering while he decides what to do. He may be a bit more pondering when it comes to the planning of things. He may want to look at more variables. He may want to take more time in the approach on an adventure. So a lot of your pre-adventure planning, a lot of your room-to-room rest time activities as an elf are likely going to be informed by this. But it's important to recognize that, and I know I'm talking about elves specifically because they're the best example, I think, for what they have going, because of a race that's hard to play if you play it as written. One could, certainly, half-orcs are a good example, because half-orcs are, I think, universally played as basically orcs, but I think that's a mistake. A half-orc has just as much of a chance of having been raised as a human, with human sensibilities, but maybe just a little bit hot-blooded as his race. So, you could argue that, and where I'm going with this is that these idiosyncrasies that the various races hold are going to be keys to really good role playing, or opportunities to role playing, not just for you as a player playing an elf, but also as a DM running elf NPCs or half-orc NPCs, these various races, but also, as party dynamics. If you've got an elf in the party and that elf is really constantly deliberating everything, and you have much more immediate character races in that party, this is going to create conflict. And one of the things I've been telling my players in my group recently is those conflicts, have them in character, have them at the table. If your character would not do something or is going to act in a particular way, make him act that way, but make him act that way in character. Don't be brash out of character, and just, if you're going to play a brash character, don't just be the guy who barks out, I do this, I hit it with my sword. Still try to role play. If you're a brash character, and you would simply say that, my character, I growl or I grumble, roll my eyes, impatiently, and march forward, pulling my blade, and you can be descriptive and role play that nature. So with an elf, Going back to the elf as an example, if you're playing an elf and the party is having to constantly put up with your elf and his long thought processes, his lengthy way of doing things and considering things, then they should play off this. At the same time, you as the elf, if you're playing the elf, would want to use this as a way to have your character grow and develop. Sure, his elven nature is such that he has always lived this long life, this path of casual flow through existence, or not necessarily casual, but just very deliberate, planned methodology to his life. It could be that he is now seeing the benefits of these more immediate races. They, at first they might infuriate him, but it could be that through the course of your campaign, this opposition, these opposed views between the characters, is really where a lot of that character is coming from. Your elf is going to see that there are times where perhaps being more aggressive, more proactive, more immediate are going to be important. Maybe there isn't always time for waxing philosophical and contemplating the proverbial navel of everything that you come across. Just like your half orc, who is constantly saddled by his racial anger and his general bubbling fury. It could be that over time he learns that this gets him in trouble. This gets his friends in trouble, and these friends who have put themselves out for him or taken him in when others wouldn't, really deserve more, and it becomes a struggle, an internal conflict for that character. And conflict is always good for role playing in one form or another, whether it's internal conflict or external conflict or inter-party conflict. I really don't think that true role-playing comes from parties that are a bunch of like-minded folks who are, yes, what ho, let's go ahead and slay the dragon, ha ha. It's very cardboard, it's very two-dimensional. If you're looking for true role-playing, you need to have those added dimensions. And conflict is a way to do that. Now, conflict does not mean bungling through and constantly interfering with the other players, with the other characters. That's not what I mean by conflict. But your races are going to provide that conflict for you if you're playing them closer as written. The alien mindset of a tiefling, the whimsical nature of a gnome, the kind of homebodied, comfort-minded halfling. These are things that while they you don't want to reduce a race in D&D to a stereotype. Fantasy is kind of built off of stereotypes, or at least traditional fantasy is built off these stereotypes, at least as a base. It's really easy to grab the stats and just play the character that you want to play anyways. But at that point, you're just stat grabbing, or and I'm not saying don't have that amazing character who is the the high elf who was raised by orcs or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's not what this video is about. This video is about looking at what makes a race interesting. When you first read through the description of that race, something made you want to, unless you're stat grabbing, something made you want to play that race. Now, it could be that you're just the cosmetic appeal is there, or the very superficial aspects appeal to you, and that's fine. But if you're going to dig in deeper to that character, you're going to want to really look at those things that make them unique and make them interesting, and learn to play with those in a way that is constructive to the game and not disruptive. Far too often, those character traits, those racial traits, get used at a level of high cliche where they're just ridiculous and they're doing nothing but making they're kind of lampooning the species or the race rather than species is a more accurate term if you really think about it, but D&D uses the term race, but you're really lampooning the races as opposed to actually celebrating what it is that makes them interesting. So yes, you could have your halfling homebody who is very comfort minded, but perhaps he's in conflict with himself. We see this and of course we see this in the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, where we see the halfling who is really struggling with himself. This would be the quintessential halfling character, I guess, struggling with his nature, which is to stay comfortable, keep his head down, stay in his hole, and live a long, happy, fat life. But there is something greater. Now, that something greater doesn't have to be the end of the world, like, Lord of the Rings, and it certainly doesn't have to be being pried out of your hole, to go on adventure. Although I think that, for most D&D characters, that's a little bit more on the nose. Bilbo is very much the template. Frodo is the variant. Merry and Pippin, and Sam, they're all, they're all variations on that theme. Sam, I think, is actually in the Lord of the Rings. Sam is sort of the proxy for your standard halfling template in that party. He's very homebodied, he's very worrywartish, he definitely doesn't want to go forward, but he is challenged, and he needs to move, he needs to push on because his friend is there. So while in that case it's his fellow hobbit that's his friend, his fellow halfling that's his friend, there's nothing to say that you could not have an elf who sees that if he's left, he's in conflict because his people want to sit on their laurels and deliberate, or they don't want to get involved in the affairs of men. But maybe he sees that there's something different. Now, that's not to say he's not going to be that way. I think if you're going to play a character, an elf character, and kind of going with the gist of this video again, for the point I'm making here is, you don't have to toss that aside to play an interesting elf. That would be an easy way to do it. That's the usual way that people play it. I'm an elf. I've got pointy ears. I am slightly shorter than people. I am sprightly, and I'm good with a bow. Tra-la-la. I'm an elf, and that is really as far as it goes. There are some interesting elf characters that are out there. If you're old enough to remember a gem of a movie called Hawk the Slayer, this to me is one of the most successful D&D movies. It's never been an actual D&D movie ever. It's low budget, it's old school, but it has what you would expect for a D&D party. But in that particular movie there's actually a couple of good atypical racial characters. You've got an elf, his name is Crow, and he plays himself. His character is made, part of the way the character is played based on, I would say, the other kind of extremist character generation, like kind of, instead of being different from his kind, he's in Hawk the Slayer, he's the last of his kind. So he's played as a very morose, somber, cold character who is tormented and troubled. He's slow, but he has a connection with the other characters that pushes him to action. While the rest of his people have disappeared from the world, he is still there, and he's going to push on. Now, also in that movie is a dwarf character whose name escapes me, and I do apologize, but it's been a long time since I've watched that movie and lived and breathed it. I have watched it, I would say, actually, I'll be honest, I have watched it this year. It's out there on YouTube. Well, here on YouTube. And this dwarf is not your typical armor-wearing mini Viking, with a hammer or an axe. He is leather clad, carries a whip, is a trickster, and a brigand and kind of a scoundrel type character. He's not a halfling, like, he's not a Merry and Pippin, ha ha ha, broke in and stole your bread or whatever, or stole your pies off your windowsill. He is kind of a scoundrel. He's tricking the other characters out of their meals. He's kind of bad mouthed and stuff, but he's still loyal. So he still has that loyalty of a dwarf, but in the end, he himself is, kind of I would say an atypical dwarf in that he is not a fighter. He's not a cleric. He's not a bastion of his people. He's kind of a short little shit. And, that is his character, but it plays well. I think it's a good, successful variant. He is still a dwarf. He still has those characteristics that make a good dwarf. He's stubborn. He's loyal. But he is a thief. I think he's a little off center from the discussion here, but Crow is a good example of an elf who is played like an elf, but does not hinder the party. In both these cases, they don't really hinder the party. Dwarves, I don't think, ever hinder a party. To be honest, a dwarf played out of the book is a perfect adventurer. They're always up for a good fight, at least in most interpretations. But are people really grabbing the nuances there? I mean, I'm not going to go through a detailed description of nuance or examination of the nuance, because it's really not within the scope of one video. Maybe down the road I'll pick a race and really go into detail. But when this is sort of a counterpoint to the video I made before, which is don't define your character by your race. This is an invitation to look at what defines a race in D&D and try to play to that, but find ways that are working that element into the story in a way that's not disruptive to the rest of the group, in a way that is not problematic for you as a player. You don't want to play an elf who just doesn't do anything, but I think it's a matter of reading what is there and reading and understanding as a people. This is their default, but even elves have things that matter to them. Even elves have things that they care about, and there's no way that elven society has existed in your fantasy world for the thousands of years that it has without getting embroiled in a war, without having to defend themselves. Elves are very often and almost universally depicted as very militant, as a very militant race, and so that itself means that they have some sort of concept of the need for action, but action is not always defined by fighting, and so the other actions that your elf takes are certainly going to be where you could play them, interestingly enough. Now, what that means is you're going to have to concede as a player that your character's racial default behavior is likely going to be at conflict with the rest of the group to a degree until it is worked out through roleplay that it's not. And the rest of the party, the rest of your players, the rest of the players at the table, DM included, you kind of have to accept that as well. But that's the challenge. So while, if you're going to, you've trudged through the forest, the ancient, maybe the ancient jungle looking for the lost ruins. The humans, of course, they're all about, bold expansion, adventure. Your half-orc has been clobbering every snake that pops its head out of the bushes. The halfling has been complaining about his belly not being full enough, or maybe he's been stopping and gathering every wild mushroom and, succulent root that he finds along the way. The dwarf is steely-eyed and very purpose-driven. There's ancient treasure in these lost ruins, and he's bound to recover it for honor or whatever. Your elf is concerned and thoughtful about the process and is likely going to be deliberating every move. that's where the play is going to come in. That's where the fun is going to come in. That's when the role play is going to come in. So, when you get to those ruins, when the party makes it through the jungle, and they've fought a bunch of fights, and they've banded, they've bonded over these conflicts and these trials and tribulations as they're going through the jungle, and get to those ruins. What happens next? The human and the dwarf and the orc maybe, yes, let's go in. And the halfling's like, I don't know, I'd really much rather stay back here with the ponies. And the elf is going to be wanting to think this out and look at it and contemplate it and see what's going on. Or will things have changed on that journey? The halfling is, comfortable, while I'd rather, while I'd rather be out here with the ponies, I trust my friends. The dwarf is like, you have nothing to fear, my little friend. I will protect you. The half orc is, you've saved me pulled my hide out a dozen times. The least I can do is stand with you. Or maybe that half orc is now listening to the elf because he realizes that the elf with his insight and his deliberation is, saved the party on numerous occasions. Maybe his thoughtfulness helped them solve a puzzle, whereas they just wanted to bash through, and it was the difference between getting attacked by, a horde of, pygmy mummies, and, or tripping that trap in the temple or whatever. Maybe he's figured it out. Now, he's not stopping being an orc, but that development came from the fact that he started being very typical of his species. He started playing as his book species. That elf now, where's he at? He may not be as, cerebral and slow when he gets there. The time for all of that may be past. Maybe he realizes that the urgency is here and he needs to trust the gut feeling of his human friend. At the risk of, blurring the lines here, it's kind of a Kirk Spock thing. And I'm sure everybody will, there are people who would scream that it's not true, but Spock is basically a space elf. They wrote him like an elf. They just put a sci-fi veneer on it. And it's not to take away from the character. It's just they were building off of tropes. But I think that Kirk is a lot like a lot of the human fighters and stuff like that you're going to see played at a table. And Spock is probably very similar to a lot of the elves that are played. But if you look at the way that those characters develop over the course of that franchise, eventually it gets to the point where Kirk and Spock are very much reliant on what makes the other one unique. And this, I think, is really key to making this, to really understanding and making this experiment here work. If everybody's playing the same character at the table, they just have elf ears and elf stats, there's there's less distinct development as a character, and there's also less reliance upon one another to make the party work. And I'm not just saying combat stat wise, I'm talking about actual role playing encounter wise and stuff. So just like Kirk and Spock, your elves and your dwarves and your halflings, if they're played closer to what makes them unique, played closer to what's in the book, that is then going to give you a party that has individual growth on a character by character basis, but also much greater party growth. And that is not to say that you have to have them all be a fractured bunch of who's-its who are just cookie cutter elves and dwarves and gnomes and halflings, but it is saying that there is something, a lot of work has been put into defining these characters. And if you're really interested in seeing, getting greater information as to how to play them, because the write-ups in the basic book are pretty, and the rule books are pretty basic. There have been a number of different Dragon Magazine articles, and I'm sure you can find those through the various archives and Google searches and stuff. And even online articles where they kind of paraphrase a lot of this information or write up new essays on this. They've been written over and over, and there are some very detailed runs on how to play elves. Second edition had entire source books for each species. Complete book of elves, complete book of dwarves, complete book of halflings. These were incredibly in-depth, and even if you're playing 5th edition, track these down and really read into them. I think that's about 2nd edition is where we learn that elves don't sleep. Elves, that's where the concept of the elven kind of meditative reverie came into play, when they were trying to write them to be a little bit different, where they're because that hadn't really been defined as far as, I mean, it may have been in some of the earlier Dragon magazine articles, but like I said, those articles have been written over and over. I mean, 3.5 even did, when 3rd edition kind of came on the scene, there was even a series of articles or issues where each issue focused on specifically one race, and they would go into breakdown with language. And I mean, I know that the 3.5 or the 3rd edition article in Dragon on elves even talked about the elven concepts around divorce. You know, how do elves part company? So there's a lot of good stuff to read out there. Read it, and then maybe as you're reading it, write down some key points, and then try to play those out. Next time you're playing a race that is not human, really consider playing that race. Try to play it different than human. Try to play it different than yourself. That's hard to do, but it's rewarding. If you can pull it off, you're going to have a lot more fun. Your party is going to have a lot more fun. Your friends, your party, your players are going to have a lot more fun. Your DM's going to have a lot more fun because it's going to give him more to work with, different personalities and stuff. So, again, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, comment below. Share some examples of opportunities where you had a chance to play, where you think that you were playing an elf or a dwarf or whatever closer to how they're written, and or your thoughts on things that might make it simpler or harder, or difficulties you may have. If you are wanting to post something a little bit more in depth, you can also visit the Elfbait Facebook page. Recently changed that to an open group, hoping to build a little bit more community around it. But yeah, so this is Eli from Elfbait. This has been kind of a rambling discussion on looking at race as a wellspring of role-playing, as opposed to something to be cast aside just for the sake of stats and appearance. Get out and game. My voice is evidently going to fail me, so it's a good time for the video to end. Take care.